So, thanks everyone. Let me take this pointy thing. A fairly gentle chat, this, with not many results and not many equations, and really just looking back over work we did over rather a long time and trying to ask, why we did what we did and why we didn't do what we didn't do, really. So, myself in Trinity College, Dublin. Lucas Ismail in the University of Ferrara, but usually in Trinity College Dublin half the time, and shortly to move to a more permanent residence in Sheffield, I believe. So I'll be sorry to lose it. But anyway, just looking back over work that myself and Luca and other people in our group have been doing over 15 years, and really, I suppose, trying to ask, well, what was our thinking? Why did we do things in a certain way? Because I suppose you make some decisions in research, either explicitly or maybe implicitly without thinking about them, but they do determine the direction you take. And I suppose a big one for me was that we were looking for engineering solutions, trying to understand the science on the way, but really looking for something that would be useful for engineers, and looking at real components. So I was fortunate to be doing work with various industries like car industry people or whatever, who were sticking things like this crankshaft in front of us and saying, well, it's all very well these notched specimens, but can you predict what the fatigue behavior of my crankshaft is going to be? So, it kind of pulls you into the real world. And if you want to develop, methods which are going to be translatable into the real world, then you take certain decisions. So, for example, well, we said we had to be able to make predictions which were just based on the stress field or strain field or energy field or whatever, let's say stress field in the body, so that equations shouldn't have things like the notch length or the root radius of the notch or whatever in them, because you can't have those same parameters in the real component. So we said, no, we're only going to look at the stresses, etc., in the body, which of course is fundamental idea of this whole conference anyway. And the other thing was that we would consider all kinds of stress concentrators. So for us, cracks or notches are just particular examples of a general stress concentrator which could have any geometrical shape, like a corner or a groove or a bend or whatever, or even a contact problem where you have a localized stress because two bodies are in contact. So as far as we're concerned, we don't have to know what the shape and size of the thing is. We're just looking at the stresses, finding out where the stresses are highest, and then looking at the stresses in that region. So that was a kind of fundamental thing. But it does take you down a certain route. What we found over the years was that we kind of stopped using cracks because we found it's much easier to do tests using notched specimens rather than cracked specimens, as we find they tend to fool you. And even in a lot of cases we're not very happy even about using plain specimens because they can fool you as well. And again, plain specimens are a thing that never happens in industry anyway. So nowadays we tend to do tests on specimens of several different types of notches, different sizes or shapes of notches, and come to our conclusions just based on those. We assume, of course, that there's an accurate finite element analysis available, such as for this crankshaft component, which was done by Fiat. And I suppose that really changed everything over the last 20 years because it became possible to actually do that. For more and more components now, you can get a reasonable finite element analysis of the whole component with reasonable loading boundary conditions at the kind of resolution, the kind of element size that we would need to incorporate some of our methods. So that's really why the things that we were doing started to become interesting in industry. As a matter of principle, we try and use linear elastic analysis just because it's easier and quicker, but of course there are problems for which it's just not going to work, and then we give it up and use something else. And I think it's also important when you're trying to do this kind of work to have some kind of target for what is a successful result, because you make your predictions and then you compare them to experimental data. You want to know whether you're right or not, and so we set this target accuracy of 20% on stress. So whether that's the stress for a brittle fracture or a stress for like a fatigue strength or endurance limit or whatever. We said if we can predict the experimental results with better than 20% accuracy, then that's fine, that job's done, we'll go and do another one. Because there's always going to be some errors of that kind of order inherent in the various data and predictions and models and whatever that we're using. So these were kind of overall principles that we started using all the way through. So comparing stress fields, I suppose that the thing that we're all doing here in this conference, and it's kind of the crux of the whole problem, is that if you have, imagine two different bodies, both of which have got some kind of stress concentration feature in them, and you look at the stress fields, and I keep saying stress fields, but you could say strain fields or energy fields, doesn't matter, but you look at the stresses in those two bodies, the two bodies are going to have the same mechanical behavior if the two stress fields are the same. Okay, so if one is going to fail, the other is going to fail, and so on. And really, all we're talking about is what do we mean by the same? All right, sounds silly, but here's a more concrete example. So I've got a specimen here, a standard specimen with a crack in, and I've got, say, a stress against distance for that. And then I've got some real problem, happens to be a finite element analysis from a crankshaft, where I've got a local hotspot of stress, and so the red line is what's actually happening in the component. So if I know that a fatigue crack is going to propagate in the specimen, is it going to propagate in the component or not? Okay? And we say, well, yes, it will if the two stress fields are the same, because that makes them essentially identical problems. But of course, they're never really going to be the same. There's always going to be some differences between those two lines. So therefore, we have to come up with some criteria which will allow us to know whether we can treat these two as being the same or not, really. And I think that's it, and there are lots of different criteria that people use. So I'm going to talk about two methods which we developed, one called the crack modelling method and the other called the critical distance theory, which are both really, it just comes down to this question. You've got two wiggly lines and you want to know whether they are going to lead to the same physical behaviour or not. So the first one is this thing called the crack modelling method, and this goes back to some work that was done by Rod Smith and Keith Miller in the 1970s, and it was a little bit of work, and they only published a few papers on it, and it's one of these things, I think it's really important and really useful, and it hasn't really been picked up or used very much. In fact, I think it's actually the best thing that Rod Smith and Keith Miller ever did, but we can argue about that later. But what they showed was this, that if you look at data on high cycle fatigue from notch specimens, and you look at high cycle fatigue strains that have 1 million cycles or 10 million cycles or whatever, and you look at all the notches, then you can divide all these notches into one of two types. That they're either crack-like or they're not. Okay? The sharp notches are crack-like, which means that they can simply be treated as if they were cracks. So you have a notch, which of course has a finite root radius, but you can do an analysis in which you pretend it has a 0 root radius, and so calculate a stress intensity for it, and the prediction works fine. So that's one type of notch, and if they're not crack-like, then they are notches which exert their full KT effect. So KT is equal to KF. Okay, so really, all these strange ways of these empirical equations and things for comparing KT and KF, you don't need to use them at all, because this is the case. Either you can use KT or you can't, and if you can't, you can just pretend that the notch is a crack. Okay, and it really is as easy as that. They did it for high cycle fatigue, turns out to be also true for brittle fracture, and these are the kind of graphs they were drawing. This is some data from tests on notches in steel, actually, which I put together with their predictions, but it works the same way. So here you're looking at a fatigue limit for a series of different notches with different KT factors, and what's constant here is the length of the notch. Okay, so in all these specimens the notch length is the same, and so KT is being increased by sharpening up the root radius. Okay, so if you have a low KT factor, less than about 4 in this case, then the fatigue limit, this is the plane fatigue limit, just comes down, and it comes down exactly by dividing by KT. Okay, so that's very simple. The dividing by KT line carries on down here, and obviously underestimates the data when you have sharp notches, but all the sharp notch data lie on that dashed line, which is the LEFM predictions, just pretending that these notches are cracks. So this would be a prediction which would be valid out here at KT is infinity, but in fact it turns out to be valid all the way into the point where these two cross over. So there's some differences, of course, between the data points and the predictions. They're really very close for a lot of different materials. So that's what they did, and I think that's very important. The problem then with translating that into using it for an engineering component is to know what is the LEFM prediction in the case of a component. So in this case it's fine because I've got a notch at a certain depth, let's say an edge notch of 3 millimeters long. So I can say, well, that's the same as an edge crack 3 millimeters long. So now I know the equation for stress intensity and I can plug it in. But supposing I don't have that, supposing I've got a component which has a corner with a certain fillet radius or something like that, okay? So if a 90-degree corner, for example, if the fillet radius of that corner is small enough, I can imagine that it's going to be one of these crack-like notches. But the problem is, what crack is it now like, okay? Because I don't have a length anymore, so I don't have any way of calculating the K value. So what we did was just to develop some methods of looking at the post-processing the FEA stress field to make this, to find out what crack this problem corresponds to, okay? And so we come upon this problem of two stress fields and deciding whether they're the same or not. And yeah, it actually doesn't matter too much what method you use, but we just use a method of minimizing these areas between these two lines, between the line that corresponds to the crack and the line that corresponds to the component feature. Now, of course, you have to have limits on this. You can't look at R is 0 because the crack has gone to infinity, so you have to have some positive R min. And you don't want to look too far out because you might start seeing effects due to other features in the component or whatever. So you have to limit yourself to two values there. But apart from that, it's not difficult. And then all you do is you keep changing the parameters in the crack model, and so you can vary the position of the crack line until you get a crack line which is as close as possible to the component feature line, and then that's your best guess as to the equivalent crack for the problem. So that's it. It works remarkably well. I won't show you results because we published a number of papers with all these results in, but suffice it to say, we looked at a lot of different materials and different notches, and also 3 or 4 actual component problems where we could get good results from this. It's a funny thing actually that very often the notches or features don't really look like cracks at all. If I go back to that graph, here it's crossing over at a KT value of about 5. But for some materials, that crossover could happen at 3 or less, okay? So you might have something that's actually a circular hole, for example. You wouldn't dream of thinking it was a crack, but it turns out to be one of these crack-like notches, and so the prediction works fine for it anyway. So sometimes intuitively you wouldn't expect to use a crack model, but it turns out you can. Okay, so that's that one. So that's the first of the 2 models. How long have I got, by the way?
Still have like maybe 5-7 minutes,
oh, okay.
And then we will have only 5 minutes for discussion.
Okay. So, theory of critical distances then, that we're talking about quite a lot, but it's been well introduced by Professor Haskes and 1 or 2 others already, so I can go fairly quickly. And it's just because, of course, fracture processes are affected by the structure of the material, from the atomic or nanostructure up through the microstructure. And so, if you use continuum mechanics, you're also always going to come upon problems where the continuum mechanics breaks down. It's a natural thing that's going to happen. And there are some interesting problems in fracture mechanics where it breaks down, which is when the length scale, which is always something like the microstructure. Now we can talk about exactly what it is, but it's always of the same order of magnitude as the microstructural scale. when that length scale becomes similar to something else in the problem. So, of course, we know about short crack effects, which happen when the crack length becomes small compared to this length scale. If we compare notches with cracks, then if the root radius of the notch becomes this length scale or less, then it effectively becomes the same as a crack. That's the whole specimen size, important for small specimens or certain materials like concrete, which have very large scales. When the specimen size starts to intrude. Oh, and I could have put in another one, which is thresholds, because fatigue thresholds, you get the threshold happening when the plastic zone size is the same order of magnitude as the grain size. Again, so again, you start to, you know, the microstructure starts to intrude on your nice, smooth continuum model. Okay. So what do we do in these cases? Well, we could go in for, and quite rightly, go in for complicated scientific analysis where we build up from the nanoscale to the microscale to the microscale, and we're glad to see that, you know, people are doing that and trying to develop, you know, complete models of how materials behave at all different length scales. But we're not there yet with that. There's certainly a lot more to do on that. And in practice, in the short term, we need an engineering solution. So this critical distance method is really just the simplest possible way of introducing the idea of microstructure, the idea of a length scale, into what is otherwise a continuum mechanics model. Okay, so we just define some length constant which stays constant, and then when you change the scale of the rest of the problem, the length constant doesn't change, and so that solves really all of these kinds of problems. It starts to correct the continuum solutions in all these problems. And there are two types of, within the family of what we call the theory of critical distances, there are two types of methods. One which is based on local stresses, either averaging stresses on a line or area, or choosing a stress at a point. And then there are these stress intensity methods, such as having a notch with no crack there, but you imagine that there's a crack there, or a new one which I've been working on with Pietro Ponetti and people in Torino. I think he's going to talk soon anyway. New one which we call finite crack extension, where we imagine that the crack goes forwards not smoothly and continuously, but in jumps, and the size of the jump then becomes important. And the interesting thing is that all these distances, whether you're talking about the distances involved in these stress-based methods, or whether you're talking about the lengths and increments of these cracks, they're always related to this constant L, which it always has the same formulation. So, you know, it keeps jumping out at you, whichever kind of method you try to use. Brief history, which I won't do because I don't have time, so I'm not going to talk about that. Work that we've done over this kind of period of time was mostly just in extending the theory, extending the use of the theory really into other different domains, looking at different kinds of materials and different problems in fatigue and fracture. And also trying to understand more the theoretical basis of why this method works. And for me, this what we call finite fracture mechanics now, which is this fracture mechanics of crack jumping, is, I think, the best sort of theoretical justification for the theory of critical distances. And then on a more qualitative scale, the idea that L has always got to be connected back to something in the microstructure, and very often you can show that L is directly proportional to something like grain size. Obviously depends on what material you're talking about, but in cleavage fracture of steels, for example, steels at low temperature, L is exactly equal to the grain size, and there's a direct proportionality there. So other examples of that. Recent work has been mostly done by Luca, who has really attacked the fatigue problem very seriously, I think, and so he's been over in our labs doing lots of tests and doing lots of models, and you know, he's been putting my name on the papers as well, but I'm not really sure why. So if you have any questions about this, he can answer it. But you know, I guess he took the view that in order for this theory to be taken seriously in fatigue, you have to attack the things which are the difficult engineering problems in fatigue, especially medium and low cycle fatigue, multiaxial loading, and variable amplitude loading. And in each case, he's shown that you can just use some existing approaches, like for example in multiaxial loading, a critical plane approach, but you can combine that existing approach with the critical distance theory and do all the calculations, and it still works out. Finally then, just a couple of graphs of results just to show that this is working. So this is just a couple of recent papers of Lucas and I. This one showing the predictions for multiaxial behavior. So, and this is a kind of, again, the kind of approach which Luca has taken, and I very much appreciate that. He's, looked very broadly in the literature, found as much data as he can. In this case, 300 and something experimental results, and plotted the actual number of cycles to failure against the predicted value. And basically the criteria for success here is if the data falls within these dashed lines, because if it does, it means that the scatter is no worse than the scatter on the original SN curves. So of course you can't really do any better than that. So you can see that looks pretty good, and that's for a lot of different types of multi-axial loading, and then this one is for a number of different types of variable amplitude load spectra, and again the predictions come out very well. So thank you for that very listening to that very quick and rather philosophical chat. The only concluding remarks I'll pick out, and this is really true, is that if you want to be convinced about these methods, just try them, because they're very easy. A lot of people will say, hey, this is too easy, it couldn't possibly work. But we find that anybody who's actually, made a few models and done a few tests and gone through the process of implementing the model is generally convinced of the value of these things. So give it a go. That's what I'm saying. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
We have like 5 minutes plus the tolerance of 3. The Holy Trinity rule. So the first question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, maybe to make it much easier for you, actually, what kind of singularity we are talking about? Because in the nature, you find always cracks as they have not a zero radius crack tip. Even if you have an ideal cleavage crack, you have a radius in the order of atomic distance. So there is no zero crack. So there is no real singularity. So every crack you find is actually a sharp notch. So that's first comment, and the second comment is that was also mentioned actually. But you have no linear elasticity. You always find a non-linear elasticity. If you go to say 0.2%, you have a non-linear behavior. So everything. So you have no real singularity.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think he's agreeing with me, isn't it?
What I think that Dr. Kopida is saying that the solution you propose is good, but the problem is wrong.
I think it's wrong.
Okay. One question, right now, please.
You try to take your critical distance combined with a microstructure. But when you make your experiment a different stress ratio, you will come to different critical distances. This is simple. When you take your equation, you come to different questions. That makes no sense because you have always the same microstructure.
Oh, yeah, no, I see no problem. Actually, funnily enough, looking at the data, that's sometimes yes and sometimes no. Sometimes it's pretty much constant, but sometimes it changes a lot. You're right. I guess what we are doing always is we are finding the critical distance without reference to the microstructure, right? We are finding it by doing tests on, say, a couple of different notch geometries, and this value pops up as the correct one to predict the data. Okay. But then, of course, it's interesting to look and see what is that compared to the microstructure. And as I say, in some cases, there's an exact correspondence between the crack length and the microstructure, but in some cases there's not, and you wouldn't really expect that, of course, because if you say something like grain size, well, grain size doesn't do everything. In a problem like fatigue, where the grain size may be coming in is that the grain size may be affecting the yield strength and plastic behavior, and that may in turn be affecting the amount of plasticity-induced closure that you get, and that it's the closure which is really deciding whether the crack grows or not. But so there's always a link back to the microstructure, of course, because microstructure controls everything, but it may not be a simple relationship like that. Though, funnily enough, a guy called me up the other day, and he had a problem with replacing a component in a power station, and he said, I have this cast chromium steel, it's got a very big grain size of 3 millimeters, and I'm worried about whether I should use it and whether it'll be okay with these sharp notches we're putting in it and all that. And I said, well, you need to do some tests and find out what the critical distance is, but I guess it'll be about 3 millimeters, you see? And so he came back to me a month later and said, hey, you were right. So sometimes you just get lucky.
Yeah, ask us, please.
I'm trying to understand your definition of length scale. Is it not fracture toughness over stress, was it?
No, the stress.
Yes, that's
right.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and this falls out simply if you say that if this theory should work for every kind of notch, it should work for a crack, and if it works for a crack, then the stress is ahead of a crack, so that formula drops out.
Is there a way to, maybe daft idea, but could you maybe formulate a small toy problem where you have a crack not in a continuum, but in a maybe discretized discrete lattice model, masses and springs, get a toughness out, get a ultimate stress out, or maybe related one to the other, and somehow bring in the particle spacing? Would it work?
Yeah, well, maybe it would. So maybe then the critical distance would be the spacing of your springs.
Cross fingers, ideally, yeah?
Yeah, I'd say this.
Okay, the last question.
It's interesting because your L parameter is exactly the short crack characteristic, this size of the Ohada total.
Yeah, it's A0. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I like it.
And the formula, I mean, if you do the calculations for the line average method, in fact, the equation that you get is exactly the same as El Haddad's equation. It's got that A plus A0 square.
So it will treat it like a short crack?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay.
Under plane strain and plane stress
This
condition.
is the last one.
The same notch under plane stress and plane strain condition. The strength is exactly the same.
So what is this to say?
Strength, for example, the static strength. Now I find the same sigma as the critical distance in a b-dimensional model. But this is a problem for me.
Well, just asking about plane stress and plane strain, and of course you will have a different L value because you have a different toughness or a different fatigue threshold. If you're talking about toughness, for example, of course the toughness in plane stress and plane strain will be different. So you'll get a larger L value in plane stress, and we have showed actually some interesting cases where there's data for notches in metals, where as the notch becomes blunter and you have to apply more and more stress, it changes the constraint. It changes from plane stress towards plane strain, and we can predict that.
So the
L value obviously changes.
Okay, I think that's. Well, I have a last question. No, just how would you measure or find that critical distance in a single crystal when you cannot relate it to a grain size because it's a big crystal?
Well, yes, indeed, and then you get into the fact that it's probably related to some distances in there which are the structural distances which control the strength and toughness of that crystal. So if the crystal has precipitates in it, it might be precipitate spacing. If there's nothing, it might be the atomic spacing. There are some materials like with the carbon nanotubes you're talking about, where the critical distance is just the distance between the atoms because there's nothing else in it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you once again.